All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's meeting. I would like to call to order the regular board meeting of Tuesday, February 9th, 2021. As is our custom, we begin our board meetings with the singing of our national. Today, we're very pleased to have a pre-recorded video of students from New Brighton School singing O Canada. We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories and oral practices of the Blackfoot Nations, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. We also acknowledge the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda First Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome all trustees, superintendents, staff, and members of the public who are joining us for today's virtual public board meeting. Ms. Walker, I'll just ask you to make sure that your microphone and your camera, I'll call on you to speak a little bit later, and you can turn your mic and your camera on at that point. In the upper right-hand corner, if you take your cursor to the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a little camera and a little microphone. Click on the camera, you should be able to turn your camera off. So in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, thank you very much. All right, so our first item of business is to approve the agenda for today's meeting. Ms. Meyer, do you have any changes that need to be noted?
Madam Chair, no requests for agenda changes were received for today's meeting.
Okay, thank you very much. Trustee Hare, would you please move the motion that the agenda be approved as submitted?
I so move.
Thank you, Trustee Hare. So, trustees, I'll call on each of you individually for your vote in favor or opposed. Trustee Adams?
In favor.
Thank you. Trustee Bradshaw?
In favor.
Thank you. Trustee Hare?
In favor.
Thank you. Trustee Hrdlicka?
In favor.
Thank you. Trustee Herdman?
In favor.
Thank you. I also vote in favor, so that motion is carried unanimously. Today we have 5 requests for public comment. I would ask our speakers to focus on matters before the board today and to refrain from speaking on the personal character or performance of any individuals, department, or school in accordance with our board meeting procedures. When I ask each of you to come forward to speak, please turn on your camera and your microphone and do a quick mic check just to ensure that the board can hear you. In accordance with the board meeting procedures, you will each be given 3 minutes to address the board today. In order to ensure each speaker is treated fairly, we will be adhering to the 3-minute time limit. Your 3 minutes will begin when you state your name. So Ms. Rosemary Brown, would you please turn on your camera and your microphone and do a quick mic check to ensure that we can all hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. So any organization you represent, and your 3 minutes will begin now.
Thank you for giving me an opportunity to comment on the student outcome report. My name is Rosemary Brown. I'm a member of We're Together Ending Poverty, or WTEP. WTEP has worked since 2008 to address root causes of poverty. And we understand that to understand these root causes, we also need to look at issues like racism and colonization. Over 25 years ago, 2 of our members worked in an initiative called the Committee for Anti-Racism Education, or CARE. We worked closely with the Board of Education to develop an anti-racism and equity policy that was passed by the trustees in 1998, as well as an action plan to implement this policy. Informing the work were 2 reports from the Indigenous community on education. Later, the action plan was never implemented and the policy was disappeared from the books. And so here we are 20 years later, and the gap in the high school dropout rate between students who identify as Indigenous and the total student population is appalling. We recognize that the Indigenous education strategy of 2018 to 21 is a vast improvement over the past, as well as the human and financial resources given to that policy, and that it takes time to have results. At the same time, we believe this policy needs to be strengthened and deepened if we're to truly decolonize education within the CVE and improve outcomes for students. Dwayne Donald, in the Faculty of Education at U of A, when discussing decolonization of education, talks about the importance of not ignoring or passing over the historical relationship with all of its tensions and dynamics between white colonial settler society and Indigenous peoples. And WTEP understands that the ideological underpinnings of this historical relationship are white supremacy and racism. And we understand that whether we're conscious of it or not, these things continue to operate today. So for example, residential schools were a devastating instrument of colonization. And those who designed that and promoted that policy, like Sir John A. Macdonald and Hector Louis Langevin, did so from the perspective of white superiority and entitlement. And yet today, we still find that at some levels of the CBE, there is resistance and lack of action in renaming the schools that renaming the schools that were named after these men. There's call after call in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for anti-racism training throughout society.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Thank you so much for coming to address the board today. You have exceeded your 3 minutes. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing your thoughts with the board today. Next, we'd like to invite Ms. Heather Walker. If you would please turn on your camera and your microphone, and just want to ensure that the board can hear you.
Hello, greetings.
Oh, hello. Yeah, so we can hear you. Thank you so much. And so please state your name and any organization you may represent, and your 3 minutes will begin now.
I'm here on my own. My name is Heather Walker, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today. That's better for me now. My name is Heather Walker. As a 3rd-generation settler on this beautiful land, myself and my family are privileged to be able to succeed in spite of ourselves. Not everyone is succeeding, as this report shows, noting 4.2, those who self-identify as Indigenous. And there are innumerable factors at play here, including the systemic racism these students face each day. I feel an urgent need to address inequities today, now, because what we start today won't be evident until years on down the road. 11th of June, 2008, the Prime Minister of Canada, a Calgarian, apologized to say, and I quote, "Today we recognize this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country," end quote, in reference to the residential school program. Looking back to 1877, Treaty 7 was signed between equals in ceremony to direct the future of this region. Not 6 years later, the government in Ottawa was debating its responsibilities. And it was quoted, and it was recorded that on May 22nd, 1883, Hector Langevin, Minister of Public Works, said, and I quote in part, "But they still remain savages," end quote. Not equals, something else. Now that I know this, I cannot unknow it. The effect of the residential school decision and many, many other harmful decisions at all levels of government and implemented in all levels of society created the situation we are addressing today, racism evident in poor school performance. Now I know that this harm us settlers inflicted. It pains me to walk on land once identified as Mohkinstsis, always a meeting place, always for countless generations, taken, renamed Calgary. It is a trigger for me that we are not acknowledging our mutual truth. I believe in Treaty 7, signed as equals, and I believe in reconciliation and our responsibilities. Aggressiveness is ignoring all of the triggers that daily tell us that the British conquered and this land is now our land, not everyone's, ours. The records show that Calgary's children's educational performance suffers. We are obligated to examine our aggressiveness, cultural dominance, and we are obligated to diligently work towards reconciliations. Things like names can seem small and trite, but they are not. Naming schools after leaders who are on public record calling a group of people savages perpetuates the cultural dominance of one-sided British history, when Calgary actually has a vast and complex history. Lots needs to be done, and a renaming of a public is a public acknowledgement.
Thank you so much, Ms. Walker, for joining us today. I'm sorry I tried to give you a few extra seconds there to finish up, but you have exceeded your 3-minute time with the board today. Thank you so much for coming to share your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Right, next I would invite forward Ms. Michelle Robinson. If you would please turn on your camera and your microphone, just to make sure that the board can hear you clearly.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you so much. Right,
Thank you
so
for
please
having
go ahead and introduce yourself and any organization you might represent, and your 3 minutes will begin now.
Okay, Nagana go, Nego Che Chestakomaki. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My English imposed name is Michelle Robinson. I acknowledge we're speaking English and not the language of the Blackfoot on Treaty 7 territory. My previous folks have spoken very well. I'm coming to you as a mother of an Indigenous woman, Indigenous girl, eventually to be a woman, and I had to pull her from the CBE because of some of the homophobia, racism, and sexism that we experienced. I don't think what is being properly acknowledged is how invasive racism is systemically in this system. I have tried to, politely educate. I've been part of a book club for almost 5 years. I'm part of many different organizations to try to create that positive change. We tried to initiate letter writings over 2 years ago, and that was unaddressed. So I unfortunately don't know how, as a mother, I can actually have my child continue in this system, and I'm privileged to be able to pull my daughter from this system, as opposed to so many others who have zero choice and have to expose their children to the homophobia, sexism, and racism that is so pervasive in the Calgary Board of Education school system. You're not alone. It is a national problem. We, as Indigenous people, have given solutions through the many recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, the calls to action through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the 231 calls to justice through the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry Report as well. So it is not that I come here without solutions. It's not that I come here to be problematic. This is an issue we've tried to engage many times in different realms. And I ask the CBE, when they look at their report of how they are failing Indigenous students, that they do some self-reflection and that they consider some of the changes that we've brought to the table over the courses of decades, not just today. And with that, I say thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. Masicho.
Thank you very much. All right, next we would invite Dr. Jeremy Morris to come forward. If you would please turn on your camera and your microphone to make sure that the board can hear you clearly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
We can. Looks like your video might be breaking up a little bit, but just try your audio one more time.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yes, it appears there's a little bit of a glitch with your video, so hopefully your audio will remain solid.
Okay,
But
would it be better if I
please
just turn the video off?
Sure, let's try that. And hopefully your audio
does it
stays
sound
clear.
now?
Yep, sounds good. Thank you so
Okay.
much. So please go ahead and introduce yourself and any organization you might represent, and your 3 minutes.
My name is Jeremy Morris, and I speak to you today on behalf of myself, a local resident of Mohkinstsis or Calgary, a Treaty 7 partner, lifelong learner, and an academic scientist. I also speak to you as a cis white male and member of settler society, meaning I had the privilege of passing through an educational system that was designed for me and optimized for my success. As a kid, I wanted to be many things, a writer, an astronaut, an artist. But my school paper rejected my first article, my model rocket blew up, and my art teacher called my sculpture a blob, so I'm none of those things. On the other hand, I did well in my first science class, and with that encouragement, I developed a passion that led me through many decades of education to becoming a researcher, a research scientist. So I share that personal experience to emphasize just how important early success can be, both for the individual and society as a whole. So I'm commenting today because the results for 2019-2020 shows that early successes, such as the ones that allowed me to become a scientist, are not equally obtained by different groups of science students in the CBE system. One of the most concerning issues revealed under Indicator 4 is a persistent gap in science report card results for the youngest students. Within Division 1, students who I self-identify as Indigenous scored an average of 0.5 points less than all students. Not only does this gap exist, but if you look back at previous years, we see that the gap is actually widening. So according to the demographics of the CBE, this could represent hundreds of potential future scientists who are not getting that crucial positive feedback and are instead getting a message that science isn't for them. The outcome of this sort of inequity is clearly visible. Only 1.4% of university professors identify as Indigenous, compared to 5% of the average population. Not only is this unjust, but it's also a terrible waste of potential. Settler society has much to learn from traditional indigenous knowledge and ways of relating to the natural world. So what can the CBE in particular do to help? Well, I commend you for recognizing the importance of improving outcomes for Indigenous students and creating mechanisms such as the Indigenous Education Team, the Elder Council, and the Truth and Reconciliation Circle. However, adding these mechanisms can only go so far when the core system is built on colonial and, let's be frank, racist values that are centered on the success of white settlers such as myself. What is required is a very hard look at fundamental things that Indigenous students face every day. For example, many science-oriented students who choose to attend the science program are forced to spend their days in a school named after Hector Louis Langevin, who my fellow citizens who spoke earlier explained was a key figure behind the residential school system. So correcting this obvious issue is a necessary first step in decolonizing the education system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up is Ms. Sarah Flynn. So Sarah, if you would please step forward on your camera and microphone. Just do a quick mic check so the board can make sure that we can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. So please state your name and any organization you might represent, and your 3 minutes to address the board begins now.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Dennis, for your time and consideration. And this is Sarah Flynn, and I have put 3 children through CBE. I'm addressing you as a loyal, dedicated CBE parent. My last child is in grade 12 at Western Canada High School at this time. We've had a great experience with CBE, and I'm happy to be able to continue to help. On your agenda for today is the Results 2 Academic Success Annual Monitoring Report. I would like to share some thoughts on comparing 2 student categories, all students and students who self-identify as Indigenous. The Chief Superintendent has indicated that CBE failed to make reasonable progress markers for students who self-identify as Indigenous. Indeed, the gaps in achievement markers between all students and students who self-identify as Indigenous is not acceptable. I would like to urge the board to find, as the Chief Superintendent did, that has not been made with respect to achievement markers for students who self-identify as Indigenous. Further, I invite the board to consider internal system and colonialism as root causes for the discrepancy in the 2 categories of students. CBE must engage with reconciliation by examining itself and rooting out racism and colonialism. This can be simple things like rejecting non-inclusive names of buildings or programs, or complex things like ways of knowing and learning within CBE, or teaching of history that includes all stakeholders. The end of the report calls for several measures designed to bring CBE into a reconciliation stance. Finding and rooting out systemic racism and colonialism for reconciliation, and now is a great time to begin. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so next on our agenda is item 8.1, the annual monitoring of Results 2 Academic Success. On January 12th and 26th of 2021, the trustees had the opportunity to ask questions regarding this report. The report is now on the agenda for the board to consider whether the Chief Superintendent is making reasonable progress with the provisions of Results 2. It is now the board's responsibility to consider the report as evidence of reasonable organizational progress in this results area. The board has previously approved the reasonable interpretation of this results policy, which has set the stage for effective monitoring of actual organizational performance. I would like to remind trustees that today our job is to determine whether or not the report provides sufficient evidence that the CBE has made reasonable progress towards achieving this result, and to build a portfolio of Chief Superintendent performance in the results half of the Chief Superintendent's job expectations. I would request now that a trustee bring forward a motion regarding this report.
I can do that.
Thank you, Trustee Herdman. Go ahead.
That the Board of Trustees has reviewed the results to academic success and concludes that reasonable progress is being made toward the ultimate achievement of this results policy.
Thank you, Trustee Herdman. Trustees, do you have any questions about the motion? All right, the motion on the floor is that the Board of Trustees has reviewed the monitoring report for Results 2 Academic Success and concludes that reasonable progress is being made toward the ultimate achievement of this results policy. Trustee Adams, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to amend the motion to add to the end, with the exception of Indigenous students in all academic areas.
All right, thank you. Trustees, are there any questions on the proposed amendment brought forward by Trustee Adams? All right, so the proposed amendment on the floor is with the exception of Indigenous students in all academic areas. So Trustee Adams, would you please open debate on the amendment? So trustees, we're just debating on adding the amendment to the original motion. We're not debating on the original motion right now. We're just debating on whether or not to add the amendment to the original motion. So Trustee Adams, would you please open debate?
I will, thank you. I think it's really clear. It was stated directly from the report, and I'll read directly from the report. As compared to CBE's all students results, The results for CBE students who self-identify as Indigenous show a significant gap and continue to indicate the need for improvement. I think it's all right there in the report. We also heard from several people today as well about the gap and their concern about that. Our motion is directly about reasonable progress. And I think with our students who self-identify as Indigenous, having the significant gap, I don't believe that we can pass this motion as it is without actually talking about the Indigenous students. Thank you.
Thank you. So any other trustees for first round of debate? Trustee Hrdlicka, go ahead.
Thank you. First off, I would like to say I'm grateful to the Indigenous education team for all their work. I believe there are some very important initiatives in the strategy, like elders teaching courses like science and the Truth and Reconciliation Circle. I'm looking forward to where this takes us. I have no question that we have a commitment as a system to Indigenous students and truth and reconciliation. But as a governor, I must look at the evidence in front of me. Indigenous students graduated almost 40% below non-Indigenous students this year. Along with the Indigenous students at the CBE, Indigenous students at the CBE were 17% below the 3 to 5 year graduation rate of Indigenous students in the province. Maybe we as a Board of Trustees need to think outside the box for ideas that will make an impact on these results. I have brought forward this exception for the past 4 years, based on the belief that things would get better. In my opinion, our results should be better. I have not seen significant improvement over 5 years. Therefore, I cannot support this motion.
Trustee Hare, go ahead.
Thank you. I think it's obvious that our results in regards to Indigenous education, well, quite simply, we're not making reasonable progress. And so I guess if we really wanted to, clearly, Trustee Adams' amendment could be supported. But I think some of the points that Trustee Hrdlicka, we really have to take into consideration. We've been at this for a while, and it seems that we're not making progress. We're certainly not making reasonable progress. And actually, in comparison to the rest of the province, we're not making the progress we would like either. So that's a hard truth to face, because I believe that we're trying, but obviously we're just not succeeding. So where do we go from here? Do we go through the motions of passing this exception and then the year can take a look at it again? Are we going to admit the fact that this is just not good enough? You know, we may claim that our other students are doing well, but really, how can we say that when a significant group is not doing well at all? A public school system brings us all together, and when one fails, we all fail. And we're just not doing well in this situation. So I think we have to look at ourselves and make a tough decision here today. We have to face and we have to make certain decisions, and this will certainly be one of them. Thank you.
First round of debate. I can go ahead and enter this round. Sorry, I'll turn my camera on. I apologize for that. So I will support the amendment to the motion to add, with the exception of Indigenous students in all academic areas. The report indicates clearly that that our students who self-identify as Indigenous are not succeeding the same way that the other students are. And so it makes perfect sense to me to add an amendment to the motion that says, with the exception of Indigenous students in all academic areas. Trustee Herdman, go ahead.
Thank you. As others have mentioned, the data is very clear that and administration in their report has said that Indigenous students who self-identify Indigenous are not succeeding as we would like. The gaps are not narrowing as much as we would like, and the results are very low. And this is how we recognize that fact, is through making a motion in our results policies that identifies this to ensure that it will go into the chief superintendent's summative evaluation. If we do not pass a motion like this, it's saying that the results are acceptable. So I'm not sure why anyone would vote against results that clearly everyone does not find acceptable. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other trustees for first round of debate? Okay, moving to second round. Any trustees for second round of debate? Trustee Hare, go ahead.
Yeah, the interesting thing is you know, we can play and we can play with amendments, and yet of course we're actually dealing with people, and we're actually dealing with people who have under difficult situations for some time. Now clearly we're not going to right all the wrongs of racism and nativism which have occurred in this country for over a century. We do play a part. And so I think, you know what I mean, clearly to vote in favor of the amendment is one thing, but then to vote in favor of the motion as amended may be actually another. People can interpret these motions perhaps any way they wish. But the big thing is the students coming out of this system, trying to get on with their lives. And we know that First Nations people have tremendous challenges. We take a look at Canadian statistics, their overrepresentation in various systems which do not offer them or for Canadian society. We know that education is important. We know that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People only promoted, you know, minimum standards. We as the system must go further. And I think we've tried, but we just haven't been successful. These motions pass or not today. I clearly hope that we as a system understands that it's clearly time for us to adhere and listen to some of the statements that were made by the people who spoke at our meeting today. It was really tremendous to hear them. These are tough decisions, and I think we have to move forward. But I think today's discussion moves us forward in the sense to, hey, we are admitting we need to make progress. We are admitting we haven't done, we are admitting to do better, and we are admitting we will not turn our back on this situation. Thank you.
Trustee Herdlicka, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that, as a board, we follow a governance model, and a governance model that gives us the opportunity to make an exception at a meeting. But should making an exception should be temporary and not the norm. And so this will be the fifth year now that we're making an exception. This isn't like grade 9 math that we need to look at for a year or two. This is a group of people that we need to make an exception for. And this to me is troubling. And I would imagine the folks that actually created the governance model that we follow did not have this in mind when they created it. So I think we have an opportunity here. And I think it's important that we consider that opportunity as we vote today. Thank you.
Trustee Bradshaw, go ahead.
Thank you. So I wasn't sure how I was going to vote on this today. I'll probably elaborate better on the main motion as to why that is. But to be honest, I've heard nothing but compelling reasons about why this exception needs to be made from all of the speakers today. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Trustee Herdman, go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to say that I agree with Trustee Hrdlicka that exceptions have been made for several years now in regards to students who self-identify as an Indigenous. And I expect that they will be made for many years to come. And I do not see that as contrary to our governance model at all. In fact, it shows how our governance model is supposed to work by identifying areas of exception. Then it tells the administration clearly and definitively what areas they need to focus on. In the absence of such motions, it doesn't. I mean, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, when it talked about closing achievement gaps, it talked about doing it over the course of a generation. This is not something that can even happen in 5 years. And while we may be disappointed with the lack of progress over the past 5 years, I don't think that means that we should not make a motion of exception, because it is through these motions of exception that we give clear direction to our administration. Thanks.
Thank you, Trustee Herdman. I guess I would echo some of the comments that have been already made. We aren't here obviously to debate our governance model, but what I will say is that part of the strength of our governance model is our ability to be able to make an exception like this. This is exactly how we have an opportunity to highlight for our administration, that we are struggling with the results of our students who self-identify as Indigenous, that it's not okay with the board that our students who self-identify as Indigenous are not catching up to the remainder of our students. And so it is our responsibility, I believe, to identify this exception. And I would say that, this exception was identified in the report itself. The administration also sees that, there is a struggle in closing the gap for our students who self-identify as Indigenous. So again, I will be supporting this amendment to the motion. And Trustee Adams, would you like to close?
I think I'm good. Actually, I think everything has been said. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. All right, so I'll call each of you now individually to indicate whether you are in favor or opposed to the amendment. All right, Trustee Adams?
In favor.
Thank you. Trustee Bradshaw?
In favor.
Thank you. Trustee Hare?
In favor?
Thank you. Trustee Hrdlicka?
Opposed.
Thank you. Trustee Herdman?
In favor.
Thank you. I also vote in favor. That amendment is carried. So the main motion as amended is that the Board of Trustees has reviewed the monitoring report for results to academic success and concludes that reasonable progress is being made toward the ultimate achievement of this results policy, with the exception of Indigenous students in all academic areas. So Trustee Herdman, would you like to open debate on the motion?
Thank you. I think that this is kind of a strange, strange circumstances to be monitoring under. But as governors of the system, we know that it is our responsibility that no matter what is happening in the world or in our school system, that we do have a responsibility to continue to monitor the results of our students. And at this time, academic achievement, which is what we're here today. So the board has approved what constitutes reasonable progress and what indicators that the board will use in order to determine that. So while I am, and administration has said that the data before us, the report card data particularly, has to be looked at in context. We know that when the pandemic hit last March, that report card grades could only go up. They could not go down. We know that the province canceled all provincial achievement tests and diploma exams, and the board agreed that we would not set targets in those areas and hence we would not be monitoring reasonable progress based on those indicators. And we agreed on that last year when we were setting targets. So that leaves us with the high school completion results, which are always a little bit laggy. So those are actually the 2019-20 results, or no, even before. Anyways, they're not last year's school results, they're the year before that school's results, because that's how we receive them from the province in order to get all the student results put together. So we know that that data is a little bit older, and our report card data does need to be looked at in context. However, it is important that we look at the data we have. And I was glad to see that the administration has looked more at gaps analysis this year rather than just improvement of year over year, because I think looking at gaps is something that can be done in this context. I think even that report card data, a gaps analysis is a valid conclusion, whereas maybe improvement year over year is not. So I was happy to see a lot more of that in the report. And I think we had a lot of good conversations around board strategies in the last two board meetings when we talked about all the different areas and how they could be improved. I am looking forward to conversations around future targets and how we will determine for the areas of concern what targets we need to set going forward. But in the meantime, based on the targets and indicators that the board has approved in order to measure reasonable progress for this report, I believe that reasonable progress is being made. Thanks.
Thank you. Trustee Bradshaw, go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, I just split my notes here. So I want to read you a quote from Albert Camus. There have been many plagues in the world, as there have been as many plagues in the world as there have been wars, yet plagues and wars always find people equally unprepared. So I'm really struggling with our R2 this year and how to vote today. If you read our policies, our role in monitoring this report is to decide if reasonable progress has been made towards the completion of our results policy. Most years, that's pretty simple. It's pretty simple yes or no question. This year, if we look at our results, they look great in almost every area. It looks like the CBE hit it out of the park. I couldn't be happier. But then you scratch the surface. We know what happened in the spring. We know kids were getting an hour of online school per day. Their grades were backstopped at a certain point for the rest of the year, and that there was a massive disruption in everything. We know most of all that there are going to be gaps in learning that will take time to fill. When you scratch the surface a little more, I kind of have to ask myself, what could our admin have done? As Trustee Herdman kind of outlined, the government took a pretty strong role in what education would look like last spring. And I think given the circumstances and the direction we were being given, this is the best result that could have been expected. Each school board in the province is in the same boat. For that matter, most of the school boards in the world are. no matter how I look at this outcome, it doesn't change. Our students are going into future grades less academically prepared for next year than has happened in years past. And they're exactly where they ought to be given the shift in priorities this year. It's actually a good thing, which is kind of weird to say. Which brings me back to the quote at the start. Our governance system wasn't designed for this. No governance system is. They're meant for steady, gradual progress forward to create accountability for any backslides. They aren't meant to measure success or failure during a calamity. We didn't have a dusty binder on a bookshelf we could pull out and say, okay, our new R1 policy is going to be that every student is safe from the spread of this plague in our schools, and that's the only policy that matters this year. That shift is effectively what happened. I think in terms of extraordinary monitoring, we were getting weekly reports on what was going on in COVID in the schools, and that's been maintained the entire time. But everything that happened, it was the right thing to do. But it doesn't help us with our monitoring this year with regards to student achievement. And I was hoping at some point in the course of my ramblings, I would have convinced myself how to vote, but I haven't yet. I know our academic achievements aren't where we want based on our agreed upon monitoring report, but it's likely where they needed to be.
Thank you, Trustee Bradshaw. Any other trustees for first round of debate? Trustee Hrdlicka, go ahead.
Yeah, I would outline, I had some of the same concerns, as we look at these numbers for this year, this year, like no other year. I would say though, overall, students are doing well. There are gaps, there are challenges, but when we look at these numbers, we're doing well. Again, if we, scratch between the surface, underneath the surface, we can, understand because of COVID what emergency actions had to take into place. And I wanted to point out, I think the administration, one of the things I've noticed, the commitment to zoning in on outcomes on our report cards and the professional development and professional learning that schools and staff is moving to with our report cards is really in a good direction. The new result monitoring due to a revamp of the policy with new indicators lets us see our student cohorts in a new light. We can see those successes, gaps, and opportunities. Creating indicators for English language learners, Indigenous students, and special needs students is important as it kicks up the notch for our accountability for student academic success. And I'm really happy to see that. But I will go back to, based on my argument for not accepting the exception, to me, it is disingenuous when we accept a report that does not include all of our students. Removing Indigenous students isolates them, which we might assume would mean a greater focus, and which in turn should create better results. But I believe that is not what is occurring. Also, again, making an exception should be temporary and not the norm year after year. When it does come to the Chief Summative Report, we can make a priority for Indigenous students as trustees. When we just write down the exceptions, that doesn't necessarily mean it's our #1 priority. We've had priorities on equity and well-being. And so
Trustee Hrdlicka, please keep your debate to the motion in front of us. We've already had the debate on the amendment.
So finally, I'm connecting to that. Finally, I would say in regards, so based on this argument of not accepting the exception, hold on, I threw off here. I believe by accepting this report, we're only setting some students up for success. Seeing Indigenous students' academic results is poor and it's not acceptable. So this year, I'm not going to vote in favor of this report. Thank you.
Trustee Hare, go ahead.
Yeah, I voted in favor of the amendment because I believed it would make this motion here better and stronger. However, I do think that we have to evaluate this motion on the basis of a whole system. And clearly there are plagues can be of various kinds. They don't have to be COVID-19. They can be racism. They can be negativity, bigotry. They can be all kinds of things like that. And of course, the public school system is meant to negate those things. It is meant to bring people together and allow them to learn together and work together to make a better world and a better society. And that's what we're doing. We're facing challenges. We're not doing as well as we would like. In regards specifically to COVID-19, we know that certain sectors of our population have been more negatively impacted than others. I think we've made a valiant effort to overcome those. I think we have to try even harder. But certainly at this point in time, by taking a look at this motion, I will be voting against it. Thank you.
Trustee Adams, go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I appreciate all my fellow trustees' comments today. You guys have given me a lot to think about, which is always great. And I always appreciate that. Sorry, I'm looking down because I had some notes, but you know what? I don't think I'm going to go off that right now. I think this has been last year was a really tough year. I'm not trying not to think about this year. Let's think about last year, which is what the report's about. And it was a really tough year. And we see in the report, we're missing 2 entire data sets, which is huge. It's almost half of our report. So it's been really, really hard. There's been a massive change with it. And I'm not making excuses by any stretch of the imagination, but that was really big. Going into COVID and going into a pandemic was absolutely huge. And I think it changed all of us and all of our lives in many, many ways. And I think that's a bit reflective in our report. But I do believe that it's a solid report. And I really, as Trustee Herdman said, I really appreciate the fact that it's focusing on the gaps. And I actually think that's something that we're going to be focusing on this year and probably a few years to come, depending on how the pandemic goes. And that's really going to be important. I look at my own kids. Our report cards just came out last week, and I'm already asking myself about the gaps and how does this work and how does this reflect on my own children's academic education. And I think this is going to be ongoing for R2. I am going to vote in favor of R2. And I think it's going to be really interesting in the years to come to see how we continue to improve, identify these gaps, and start bringing our kids back to maybe where they are close to where they should be if there wasn't a pandemic. And I think there's going to be lots of challenges to come. But I look forward to how we move forward on this. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I would say, similar to what my colleagues have said, that this was a challenging report, and simply because we don't have the same amount of data at our disposal as a result of the pandemic, and because our learning suddenly shifted in March to at home from in school. Standard assessments such as the PATs and the diplomas were canceled, and class marks as per provincial direction were essentially could increase, but they could not decrease. And amid our very best efforts, not all students had equitable access to devices to complete their work. And although families did their very best to support students, we know that nothing replaces being in a classroom and receiving direct instruction from your teacher alongside your peers and your classmates. We saw incredible disruption to learning at the end of last year, and it was only a taste of what we continue to experience throughout this school year. However, even though we don't have all of the data we might be used to, learning did continue, and it is our job to determine whether or not reasonable progress has been made. Thanks to the tireless efforts of all of our staff and the grit and determination demonstrated by our students and the dedication of their families to support those students, even through this pandemic, we can see reported that even with all of those things considered, that reasonable progress has been made. And I would agree, with the exception of our students who self-identify as Indigenous. This has been an exception or area of concern for the board for some time, and it is clear that administration has been working to close those achievement gaps, and identifying those gaps is a key part to this work. In fact, we heard from administration as far back as last spring that the system approach to help close the achievement gap between our Indigenous students and the remaining population was taking a significant shift for the 2020-21 school year. At our January 26th meeting, I specifically asked a question about the Truth and Reconciliation Circle, a new initiative in our work students who self-identify as Indigenous. While our Elders Advisory Council, comprised of Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers, has been instrumental in informing our work with Indigenous students, this Truth and Reconciliation Circle will be meeting regularly, laser focused on the work that's happening in support of these students and in closing those achievement gaps. And the work will be adjusted as needed. The Reconciliation Commission calls to action specifically mentions closing achievement gaps. In order to create a more equitable and inclusive society, we need to do what we can to address those achievement gaps. I have often said in these meetings that the better we become at supporting our students who self-identify as an Indigenous, the better we will become at supporting all students. This is significant work, and it will take a lot of time. But I do look forward to a day where we will see our two results, where our Indigenous students will compare more favorably to the results of our other students. I think that this motion is stronger with the amendment, and I will be supporting this motion. All right, trustees, for a second round of debate. Right, last call for second round of debate. And Trustee Herbin, would you like to close?
Thank you. I appreciate the comments that my fellow trustees have made. It's very clear how passionate you all are about the results of our students and how concerned we all are about the results of students who self-identify as Indigenous. I think this motion recognizes that fact. And I think it also recognizes the fact that our families and staff have worked incredibly hard through incredibly trying circumstances last year in order to ensure that academic progress was still being made under, I hate using the word unprecedented, but under very challenging circumstances. And I think we do need to recognize that reasonable progress is being made with the exception of students who self-identify as Indigenous. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. All right, so trustees, I'll call on each of you individually for your vote in favor or opposed to the motion on the table. Trustee Adams?
In favor.
Thank you. Trustee Bradshaw?
In favor.
Thank you. Trustee Hare?
Opposed?
Thank you. Trustee Herdlicka?
Opposed.
Thank you. Trustee Herdman?
In favor.
Thank you. I also vote in favor. That motion carries. Are there any other motions related to this report that any trustees would like to bring forward? All right, so no other motions attached to this report?
Sorry, that's my apologies. I think I'm supposed to, I wanted to bring forward a motion around extraordinary monitoring. Is this
Now
the
would
time
be
to do that?
Yes, it would be. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. All right. 1 second, please. Okay, so I'd like to bring forward an extraordinary monitoring motion. Would you like me to read it?
Yes, please.
Okay. That the Board of Trustees directs the Chief Superintendent to provide an extraordinary monitoring report on the 2021 results to academic success for Indigenous students at a regular scheduling meeting of the Board of Trustees in June 2021 and provide an extraordinary monitoring report on the 2021-22 results to academic success for Indigenous students at a regular scheduling meeting of the Board of Trustees in June 2022.
Thank you, Trustee Hrdlicka. Trustees, do you have any questions on the motion? Trustee Adams, go ahead.
Thank you. I just have I have two questions. I'll just put them together. My first question is what exactly is extraordinary monitoring report? Like, what exactly is that? And then my second question is because we're looking at these at June 2021 and June 2022, and R2 comes to us in February. So it's in my thinking that these are would be like halfway kind of mark reports. Is kind of what I'm thinking. Maybe I'm wrong in that. So I guess my question is what data would be in them or what would be available to have in these reports?
I would pass it over to the corporate secretary to explain what extraordinary monitoring means, if that's okay. And then I will, in my debate, share other information that I think answers your question.
The terminology extraordinary monitoring basically references the concept that it would be a monitoring outside of your regular cycle. So the board receives annual monitoring reports. So once annually, this would direct your chief to have to bring forward a report outside of the regular cycle. So that's what extraordinary monitoring relates to.
All right, I just want to check back in with Trustee Adams. So she did have a question on the motion. I just want to make sure, Trustee Adams, do you need that information answered by Trustee Hrdlicka before debate?
Yeah, I guess I don't understand what data would be available to be in the report since it's a halfway report. So if that can be answered, that's great. But if she's going to answer that in debate, then that's fine as well. I guess, yeah. I just wanted to know that. That's all.
No problem. I can answer. What I would expect are similar things that we get for R2. So report card data, PATs, diplomas, if they're available, grad rates. So I'd be looking at that information so I could better understand and we could better have oversight on how those students are doing.
All right, any other questions on the proposed motion? Trustee Herdman?
Thank you, and thanks to Trustee Hrdlicka for answering that question from Trustee Adams. My question is to administration. Given the timing of when we receive provincial achievement data and graduation completion data from the province, is it and report card data from, I guess, our own system, is it possible to have a different data set presented in June than the one that we get in February? Thanks.
Chair Dennis, through to Trustee Herdman, with respect to the data sets available, I would speak to the fact that we have had a minuscule percentage of our student population engage in diploma examinations. To that end, there would be no, I have very little confidence in the ability to have any type of data set that would be valid to present around a smaller cohort as it is already. The other component related to report cards and the presentation of data at the end of June. Report cards are finalized by the third week of June to then provide that forward in a report for the end of June, given all other elements may have an impact on the quality of that data. And I might have my own question, which would relate to the analysis of achievement in R2 identifies gap analysis. So if extraordinary monitoring is identified, there are implications related to the analysis of achievement at that time period as it relates to the all students cohort. And so there are some possible implications to that end as I think about the data sets that are currently included in the R2 report. We would not have graduation rates nor completion available from the province at that time for June 2021.
Thank you. Questions on the motion? All right, so the motion on the floor is that the Board of Trustees directs the Chief Superintendent to provide an extraordinary monitoring report on the 2020-21 results to academic success for Indigenous students at a regular scheduled meeting of the Board of Trustees in June 2021 and provide an extraordinary monitoring report on the 2021-22 results to academic success for Indigenous students at a regular scheduled meeting of the Board of Trustees in June of 2022. Trustee Hrdlicka, would you like to open debate?
Sure. So the proposal to the board would be to get an update on Indigenous student academic results in June 2021 and in June 2020, just Indigenous students. And then during the next R2 monitoring, which would be in January of 2022, and then again in June of 2022. So basically it'd be every 6 months for the board to do its due diligence to understand how and have oversight on how Indigenous students are doing. For me, whatever information can be brought forward, I understand with COVID, PATs has been very limited. But we need to find a way in order as a board to monitor and also to clearly be able to have oversight on how these students are doing. I will say, we talked about earlier that we had 5 years and an exception, but actually 2 years before that, we had a concern. So it's been 7 years now. So I believe the board has to find a way to do better due diligence in oversight. And this is one way. I'm willing to negotiate and work with admin to find out what results we can bring forward. But I believe that we need to get a bigger grasp on this. Thank you.
Trustee Bradshaw, go ahead.
Thank you. I have two concerns with this motion. The first is that we are in a transition year from an old strategy. As a board, we were given an update last spring about the new strategy. We know it's a huge change from the previous strategy, and it was done in the hopes of seeing improvement in results over the current school year. However, as has been discussed, this year hasn't been normal. It's been filled with disruptions to every aspect of learning. That is very obviously going to have an effect on our Indigenous students and their results. The strategy hasn't had a fair shake. Taking extreme monitoring measures like this is likely to do more harm than good to the strategy by creating a rush to judgment about its effectiveness. My second concern is that the date by which we are being asked to monitor these results. This June takes us well out of our usual monitoring timeline, and it means we won't have a complete picture of how a year under this new strategy has gone. That seems like a wasted effort, especially in a year of COVID, when this board will be reviewing the results next winter anyway. I find the second date for the monitoring extremely problematic. We know for sure that the next board will have from 3 to 7 new trustees on it after October. We're committing that board to getting a report they may not need or want. They will be getting that report apropos of nothing at the end of the year, and honestly, it's going to be confusing and out of context, having just gone through most of a monitoring cycle. If that board really wants this report, they can ask for it next winter when the R2 results have been posted. Until then, this motion just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
All right, any other trustees for our first round of debate? All right, trustees, while you're contemplating entering first round of debate, I'll share that I think that we can all agree that the results for our Indigenous students is a concern. I haven't heard any trustee in the time I have served on this board say that they were satisfied with the academic achievement of this group of students. However, I compare extraordinary monitoring to standing and waiting pot of water to come to boil. Watching it more closely or more often will not make it boil faster. If we want it to boil faster, we need to make sure the heat is turned up higher. We need to make sure we are using the right size of pot and the appropriate amount of water, and that the pot is sitting in the center of the burner. It's a combination of those things that will make the water come to a boil faster, not standing and watching it. As I mentioned earlier in this meeting, a brand new strategy has been introduced this year around supporting our Indigenous students. One of the key elements of this approach is that each student's progress will be tracked individually so that subventions can be analyzed and adjusted as necessary. Administration is turning up the heat. They're adjusting the amount of water, they're making sure they are using the right pot, and they're moving the pot as close to the center of the burner as they can get it. This is the work of the Indigenous team and the Truth and Reconciliation Circle. This more direct and intentional approach shows significant promise, but we do need to give the system time to execute on the plan, to reflect on their work and adjust as necessary. On its own, this work would take time, and it would be safe to assume that this work will take even longer in the midst of a global pandemic. While I may be able to rationalize why the idea of extraordinary monitoring has been brought forward, I think it's premature and a somewhat unreasonable ask. Further, I believe it will be ineffective in supporting the ultimate goal, which is closing the achievement gap for our Indigenous students. This is hard work, and it will take the collective effort and commitment of our Indigenous team, the Truth and Reconciliation Circle, educators, our Indigenous students, and their families in order to move the needle. I would rather have administration focusing on the important work in front of them rather than creating additional reports. And I will look forward to hearing about their progress the next time we see R2. In support of this work and ultimately support of the students it is intended to benefit, I will not be supporting this motion of extraordinary monitoring. Any other trustees for first round of debate? Okay, moving to second round of debate. Any trustees for second round of debate? Trustee Hare, go ahead.
I found this debate to be quite interesting, and I appreciate the mental algorithms that some of my colleagues have gone through. I'm still not certain as to whether or not this is a good motion or not, but I certainly see the reason for it. And I certainly see that the mover simply has nothing but the best of intentions for the Indigenous students whom we serve. So I think we have to give it that kind of thought, that this is a motion whose time may not have come, but which clearly is one we have to consider and consider seriously. And whether or not this motion passes at this time, it clearly has to send a message throughout the system as to how serious we consider this issue. And we want to do better. We can talk about time, but students are going on with their education. They're moving into their life work. And the benefits of the best education possible are simply not being put in their way. So we have to consider this. We have to work on it. we have to move forward, the best way to go. But I think we have to look outside the box. I think we have to look forward, and I think we may have to devise some new methods to deal with what we're facing. We simply cannot do the same thing over and over and over again. Thank you.
Trustee Adams, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a tough one. I think it's obvious how much we all really care about how our Indigenous student population is doing, and I think we've really made it clear that we really want them to do better. And I think that's absolutely vital for this. I'm not convinced that this monitoring is going to give us really what we need. It doesn't sound like there's going to be a lot of data available for the report and for us to look at. And I'd really like to echo what Trustee Dennis said, Chair Dennis said. We are in the middle of a new strategy that kind of got put to the side with the pandemic, and everything kind of, I don't want to say fell apart because that's not the right word, but it was very, very challenged, and it's really hard to do that. I think we really need to give this new strategy some time. And I know it's hard because we have been looking at this for so long now, and it's like, well, here we are again. But new strategies take time, and it is a fairly new strategy, and it will take time to start seeing that needle move. So I'd really like to make sure that we give it our full attention, let that needle start to, and see what happens and see how it goes. So I think at this point, I would not be in support of this motion. Thank you.
Trustee Herdman, go ahead.
Thank you. I like Trustee Hare. I'm appreciative of the intention and the spirit in which they brought forth. However, I will not be supporting the motion because I just don't believe practically that it's feasible to have solid data sets that where administration has been given the appropriate amount of time in order to analyze them, in order to bring them forward to the Board of Trustees. So there wouldn't be any additional information that we wouldn't have already gotten in our February report. When it's been implied by some that nothing is changing, that the system is just doing the same thing year over year and getting the same results. And as we all know, that's the definition of insanity. But I don't think we are doing the same thing year after year. I think the new Indigenous strategy that has been presented to us shows far more promise than any strategy that I've seen to date. But it does need to be given time. And while it may be frustrating to have to wait, I don't see how getting more frequent monitoring reports by taking administrative resources away to creating new reports and to doing a rushed analysis would be beneficial to students. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other trustees for a second round of debate? All right, Trustee Hrdlicka, would you like to close?
Yeah, thanks. From my fellow trustees, and I can definitely hear some fair arguments on all sides. So I appreciate your voices in this. Hasn't changed how I feel. Hasn't changed how I feel because I think it is important. One of the things that I've noticed with our strategies through in 2016 was our first strategy, that we've tried things and some haven't worked. We've tried other things and they've worked. And we've continued with those or tried to strengthen those. We don't know until we try. My challenge is that as a board, we are leaving this all up to administration to do this. We have an opportunity as a board to be pushing administration on this. I think about Indigenous students and we say, well, the reasoning is, we don't want to rush this and you don't have enough time. These are children's lives. These are children that come into our schools every single day that we're saying that we don't have. From my perspective, we're not trying new ideas as a board. And I'm really concerned about that, because there are options of things that we could try, but we make a choice whether we think we should do that or not. And I believe that we should be doing everything to try to support these students. That resistance of not doing that is troubling for me. Again, I can understand the arguments, but these are students that continue to fail. So I would say that I would have been more than happy for someone to bring forward an amendment, right, to this, to look at different dates or look at different options, but that didn't happen. And that, you know, that leaves me where we are right now. And I hope moving forward, I guess we'll wait for another year to figure out, get a better idea how those students are doing. I just feel for those students who yet have to wait another year. Thank you.
All right, trustees, I'll call on each of you to indicate your vote in favor or opposed to the motion. Trustee Adams.
Opposed.
Thank you. Trustee Bradshaw.
Opposed.
Thank you. Trustee Hare.
Opposed.
Thank you. Trustee Hrdlicka.
In favor.
Trustee Herdman.
Opposed.
And I also oppose the motion, so the motion is defeated. Thank you. So that brings us to the consent agenda of our meeting. There were no items pulled from consent, and as such, all items will be deemed to be approved. The board has 1 labor, 2 land, and 2 strategic planning matters to deal with in camera following the public portion of this meeting. This brings us to the conclusion of this portion of the agenda. I'd like to thank all of you who joined us today for our meeting. Our next public board meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, February 23rd, 2021.